Hello, welcome back to the Rhetoric Prof stream. Tonight we are going to be finishing up something we started in a previous stream, which is reading Cyril Welch's essay Talking. And you're like, why would I watch that? It's Saturday night. Well, maybe it's on YouTube and it's no longer Saturday night. That might be one reason why. Or, if somehow you're hearing this, and it is Saturday night, you've already made your decision, so might as well stick around. But this piece I like a lot. It's one that I think I might consider using in the future to try to teach with. Just one of the reasons why I'm reading it. It's really one of the reasons I'm reading anything on this stream is just think about it and see what comes of reading it aloud, which is just like a different way of approaching something than just like going in your room silently thinking about something. You get a different feeling. So even if I am in my room alone, I'm at least not doing it silently. Talking. And that's what this essay is all about. It's about talking. And where we left off last time at a kind of area or place that might be, I'm gonna mute this now. Sorry, YouTube. And a place that is kind of an awkward place to pick back up on immediately. So I'm going to kind of quickly go through a couple of the things, not everything. But if you want to see the previous stream, it's also up on YouTube, where we talk about the first part of this essay. But he's talking about some ways that talking can go wrong, and he's listing 3 ways. The first one is that something can go wrong where we withdraw into the claim that the most important things defy discourse. Say, you can't put into words. There's just no way to say, real stuff. And it kind of dismisses talk in a way, but, talk in the way that he wants us to understand it. It's one of the ways things can go wrong. Another one is, he says, you insist that our interlocutor, that means the person we're talking with, take the entire responsibility for his proposals. This is perhaps the sin of old age or fatigue. Well, you don't want to do that, kids, now that he's calling it the sin of old age. So, maybe help the person out. It's kind of an odd way to approach it. Be like, someone's putting something forward. Shouldn't they defend it? It's their argument. Why is it my responsibility? But he's talked a lot before in the earlier parts of the essay of how it's important for talk that there be some ignorance, that we actually don't know what to make of things. We're kind of trying things out. So here, the kind of trying things out has to happen between people. So if you say, well, tell me more. This is one thing that American interviewers will do a lot. And it's sometimes funny when people who are not American get interviewed by Americans and they're like, no. And a reporter will just be like, tell me more. That's kind of one way it sounds like to insist that your interlocutor take the entire responsibility for the proposals. It's like, why don't you tell me something and we'll talk about it and we'll develop it together. A third sin, he's saying this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, I think it's not that serious, but a third sin against dialogue is to make out the extraordinary as a mere complicated or camouflaged ordinary. So kind of, again, it's another kind of reduction of being like, that's not such a big deal. Sometimes it's important because you're saying that to someone who's got a kind of blown out of proportion sense of something's importance. You'd say, maybe it's not that important. Let's look at it this way. But that can also be a way, that can also be done in an aggressive way, or it can be done in a thoughtless way, too, where something really important is happening for someone, or something really valuable for many people, and you're like, meh, kind of casually and thoughtlessly. So those are all things you don't want to do. And he says more about them. We're not going to go back through everything that he says about them. Just a way of catching up. This is like on the last week on the Brady Bunch. I struck the wrong tone first if that was going to be the Brady Bunch. It sounded more like a crime serial or something. Last week on the Brady Bunch, I'd be a little more chipper if it was the Brady Bunch we're talking about. But anyway, this is a recap of the last episode of the stream. Excuse me. And then, so talking more about this. This is a place where I think it's maybe, we got even further than this, didn't we? But this might be a place to pick up anyway. And start again, where he starts talking about, I lost it. Yeah, right here. the task of talking. Like, what are we really doing when we're talking? What are we trying to do? So even if this repeats a little bit of what I said the last time, I think this might be a good place to pick back up. So those are the ways that things that talk can go wrong. What is it that we ought to be doing? This is where we're going to start tonight. So welcome again. Kick back, relax. Welcome to Delilah. Delilah was this radio DJ when I was growing up. She's probably nationally syndicated, so there's a chance that you know Delilah. But she had this kind of funny way of coming between talks. It was like a mixture, at least the way I remember, it's like a mixture of smooth R&B kinds of tracks and like a little bit of love advice with some call-ins. But it was kind of a weird mix that for me always struck a particular tone. That's what I was imagining. I said, well, kick back, relax, just listen to some tracks. That's maybe not the right attitude to take, but if you want to, go for it. Kick back and relax. Listen to Cyril Welch, maybe. So, okay, our ancestors understood the task of talking as the task of discovering a topic. And people who know me personally or students of mine will know that word comes up a lot. But it's bland word in the contemporary where we use it. We really say, oh, what's the topic? It's just the kind of a general sense of things, like the most general sense of things. But topic comes from topos, which in Greek literally means a place. That's why he has that there. Or coming into a locus, which also means a place in Latin. Inventing it. And there he's referring back to the rhetorical idea of invention from the Latin word invenire, which means to literally like come into or come upon. You come upon a locus. It's like a grove. And this is a sense of how you begin discourse. This is an ancient sense, but it was like a kind of a technical discourse, actually, about these topoi, these places or these loci, of where you go to find arguments when you're thinking about how to prepare a court case. It's not necessarily like always some extraordinary thing. It's often kind of things that are part of political, civic, ordinary life. What we tend to forget is that discovery or invention of a topic or a locus occurs as a resurgence of the place itself. No longer as an ordinary or common, witness the change of the word commonplace from shared focus to banal remark. So we say today, oh, that's just a commonplace. I say that too, even though I know this, other meaning of it, older meaning, where the commonplace was this kind of very kind of striking passage at one point. It meant different things at different times. But a commonplace was like a striking passage. If you were like reading something, like I'm going to put that in my commonplace book under the heading of some idea like on vision. Or maybe I'm reading a scientific work, and this is a really captivating way of talking about vision. I want to remember this passage. Or maybe it's a kind of more moral idea of like a really good thing about what it means to be patient. People would keep these journals, these commonplace books that were really just kind of filled with these headings and striking or memorable ways of talking about those things. And that's kind of where the modern sense of topic comes from, of like, oh, yeah, the topics are those things that they're talking about in the commonplaces. And, but that's becoming kind of more bland sense today, because it could be anything. But anyway, let's go a little further. Any effort to reduce the discovery or invention to the ordinary, namely by trying to show that whatever might be said simply builds upon or distorts common sense, in the contemporary sense, which is, common. How do you relate to common sense? Some people are like, that's just common sense. They're very sometimes they kind of say it in a way that's both negative towards the person they're saying it to and also towards common sense. Like, common sense is not that great. But there's another sense of common sense that is, I think, really valuable. And it's that kind of the shared vision of a community or a group of people. Which is maybe a little bit of a different attitude towards it than just like things everyone knows. Bespeaks an effort to put an end to the talk. A drive to talk only so long as somebody happens to advance a weird proposal challenging such reduction. Wittgenstein has proven most adept at such reduction in the intellectual domain. So Wittgenstein is a famous Viennese philosopher who has a lot to say about things relating to this. Improving upon the more common propensity, simply to assert and demand it. In claiming that revealing is basically unconcealing, Heidegger, another philosopher, reinterprets in rather forceful terms Aristotle's claim that the self-generating vision, in Greek eidos, inherent in any topic, is prior to its initial presentation, hule, or however you want to pronounce that in English. And Hegel's point that insight requires us to aufheben whatever simply prevails. It's kind of like take up two things that are in some kind of tension but relationship with each other. That the moment of bringing them together in some kind of dialectical synthesis. I definitely read this part last time because I remember talking about this. Yeah, the Aufhebung is what Hegel calls the kind of moment of. It later becomes called synthesis, and which makes it maybe seem a little bit too intellectually kind of like machinic. It just kind of goes really smoothly. It's maybe a little bit of more complicated process. But anyway, let's go forward then, because I know I read this part. The third sin, certainly a cardinal one, begs for further illustration, being itself the background for much good talk. So let's remind ourselves what the third sin was again. That is, to make out the extraordinary as if it's merely the ordinary. That's what he's talking about here. The third sin, certainly cardinally, begs for further illustration, being itself the background for much good talk, especially in the academic household where we ourselves run the greatest risk of committing it. The temptation arises most obviously because much intellectual talk has as its formal topic an established literature. And here literature doesn't mean like novels necessarily. It could be like any kind of body of scientific or scholarly writing, research, that kind of thing. The history of a question, you might say, is the literature on it. Or of an inquiry or whatever. The works of authors whose earthly remains lie buried in some far-off place, and whose spiritual remains now survive in libraries, bookstores, and briefcases. We generally admit that these spiritual remains, these survivors of the spirit, also require something like resuscitation, if not resurrection. The existence of educational institutions devoted to the humanities bespeaks such an admission already. And again, I know I read this because I laughed at that because that admission is going away because there are not very many educational institutions devoted to the humanities around anymore. I mean, there's a few like places if you're really wealthy you can go to, like Swarthmore maybe. But even those places are kind of like finding ways, kind of like do we really want to? Shouldn't we have something else? Humanities. It's like we need a little more than that. And I think it's easy to just kind of take the position for me anyway to be like, yeah, well, people don't value it anymore, but it's valuable, and some people will recognize its value and some won't, and we might be sad about that, but this is the way the world is going, just kind of how things are. You can't win. But it's also maybe that the humanities hasn't done a great job of making its value well known, because when you say things like this, that it just kind of like, oh, well, the institution exists. There you go. That proves that it's valuable. It's like, yeah, maybe you're a little too cocksure there. Maybe actually the thing that you need to do is to persuade people of your value, and that's really a humanistic enterprise itself. So I think the humanities have a significant, if that value is not obvious to people, it's partly the humanities' fault themselves, which includes, me and my colleagues. Evidently, the spiritual remains of bygone ages defy our understanding either partly or absolutely, temporarily or eternally. We often hear it said that the difficulty or impossibility arises because any given spirit responds to its age, either creatively or slavishly, and is only as this response, now necessarily exiled from its truest home. There's much that we could talk about in these paradoxes of historicism. However, my only point here is that these paradoxes easily engender the sin in question no matter how we unravel them. For the greatest challenge in talking about the established literature of our tradition lies in the nature of great literature itself, not in historical distance. It's not just that it's old. There's something about, setting aside these things as the great literature. It bids us to play with proposals, therefore to accept our ignorance. Not our ignorance of what already is, but our ignorance of what might be made of what already is. And I think that this is, it's not a very popular view. I mean, I think that there is something to this view that the value of having some kind of body of shared texts can be valuable is not just merely that they are shared, because then we could put anything there. And I think that is how a lot of people look at it. Like, well, why this and not that? It could be anything. There's lots of valuable things. And that's true. That's undoubtedly true. But in dealing with the things that have accreted around, that's not a very attractive way to put it, but that is how you can think about it. The things that, the kind of barnacles on the hull of these sunken ships, from the past of people who have been thinking about questions that are kind of never going to be answered definitively, is that you encounter a kind of complexity in that question that you wouldn't otherwise if you were kind of fresh to it, even if a lot of people were looking at it together, because you'd be confined to your own historical moment of understanding. And you get a better sense of your own moment by encountering the very different ways that people approach things in the past. Sometimes you see that difference and you're like, oh, that's I'm glad we don't do it that way anymore. That's kind of silly. But sometimes you get other more complicated feelings like, wow, there was a kind of possibility there that if that got developed, like could still be around today, but maybe just never got developed for whatever reason. Because there are these kinds of contingencies, or there's something that someone was saying there that actually articulates a problem that we have better than we articulate it. Because there actually is a continuity here, or whatever. There's lots of different things that might come out of that relationship. So whether we are reading and talking about the works of Plato or Aristotle, the Old or New Testament, Kant or Hegel, we find ourselves challenged to think about what might be, namely, the extraordinary possibilities hovering over our ordinary lives. Now, it is, the ones that he draws out here are like, God damn, like the absolutely most traditional European, American, Western civ literature kind of canon of philosophy and Christian and Jewish religion. I think that doesn't maybe do it quite enough justice, and maybe does suggest somebody who would like to rest on their laurels of accepting that kind of pre-given thing. So I wonder if that's the way we should do it. But let's kind of go further and not just be critical of that selection of his sample. We sin against this literature, perhaps without really knowing what we are doing. The moment we talk as though there were one right way of reading it, of decoding its initial unintelligibility. For the one right way can never be our answer, namely in answering up to the topic itself. Rather, the one right way must claim to capture the answer proffered by the text, more exactly by the author. To be sure, a text can be established, but never its discourse. Unless we consent to reduce a discourse to an array of answers, something students initially do. You hear that, students? It's okay, we know. You can try to do that, but he's saying that's not what you actually should be doing. And also professors who never learned the difference. Oh no, some of your professors might do this too. Maybe this is partly what's happening in the devaluation of the humanities, is that lots of people have reduced these discourses to an array of answers. It'd be like, oh, I don't need to learn any languages. I have Google Translate. Now, you might not be able to learn every language, but you'd have to recognize when you're using an auto-translate feature, you'd be missing more than a little bit of what was going on in another language. Even if you spent your whole life learning a language, you would be missing things. Even in your mother tongue, you'd be missing things. So, a little bit more. It's actually kind of like not a very hospitable attitude to have, you might say. In any case, once we reduce a work to a series of right readings, all talk about it henceforth presupposes that the topic is established in principle. Such talk can embody learnedness, but never learning. That's, learnedness is, it's okay. It can be a bit show-offy. It can be really annoying. It can be useful. It can be nice. But learning is the preferred term here, clearly, for him. In it, we can lecture or take notes, but we cannot talk with one another, cannot face together a topic emerging. And given the social pressures of academia, we constantly enter into the temptation to prefer a clearly stated, even if untenable, answer to a darkly articulated, because thought-provoking question. I do feel this sometimes. I don't try to intentionally state things darkly. Hopefully I'm over that phase. But sometimes things are kind of, you can feel that if you were to as some people say, could you, I need to dumb it down. When you're dumbing everyone down, including yourself and the thing itself. You're just kind of reducing everything. Sometimes things need to be kind of communicated with a question. Sometimes the question of its meaning is part of the message. And the idea that every message could be stated as clearly as every other is maybe a limited understanding of what kind of messages there are. For one looks like a claim to knowledge, whereas the other presupposes an acknowledgement of ignorance. But you might ask, how does a genuine conversation get started? Certainly not simply by each of us admitting ignorance and expecting help from the other. Rather, each of us must believe something, must be prepared to take the lead in proposing something, for only then can there be a ball with which to play. So thinking of it that way is very different from how I think most of us approach something like argument, where argument is something to be avoided. Being like, no, we need to have an argument, otherwise we won't have anything to play with. You come to the schoolyard and be like, who brought the ball? And everyone's like, oh, now what can we do? We can fight. There's not much left we can do. We don't have something that can kind of move between us. So sometimes people do just kind of fight for fun. They're bored. They're exhausted. You throw a ball in there, maybe a kind of sport starts to develop. I think the similar thing here is that we can't just confront each other in this emptiness. We want some kind of contact, but we need that contact to be mediated by a third thing. And in talk, this looks like a position. This looks like, I'm going to kind of sit out here and defend this. And it might not necessarily be because it's your most profound conviction. That might not be actually the place that you're willing to play. If you begin there anyway, it might touch on that. It might get there. Sometimes part of what happens in play is we see the limit of play. And we say, oh, the nip can be a bite too, when hard enough. We kind of feel that out. And that's important, I think, and also to learn. But in order to have that ability to play, don't think about play just as game or just as kind of something that's not serious. There's the kind of play that we say in English a little bit less often. The kind of play around a joint or around a machine, that there are more degrees of freedom in how one can move, is another meaning of play. It might be more like that. There need to be some degrees of freedom in the talk for something to develop. But it can also be like a game. If in apparent humility, all of us prefer to probe rather than present a proposal, we all sit in the bleachers to comment on a game which others have played. Those with whom we do not even try to talk, those at whom we at most shout, which is a lot of our actual discourse is shouting at athletes who people don't really actually talk to. And then when the athletes talk, what do they say? A whole lot of nothing, usually. There's a reason for that. It's not because athletes are bad at talking. There are forces at play. There are athletes who are like, you can tell, are great conversationalists, lots of fun, and then in that interview after the game, there's just like not much to say because there's not the ball to play with is not in the discourse. It's only on the field. It's only that kind of physical moment because sport is understood in this kind of quite. Anyway, I'm going too far afield if I were to start talking about that. Anyway, that's stream for another time, talking about how we talk about sports. Evidently, we must have the courage to speak up and also the courage to reply. Why courage? Well, we might get a tongue lashing for our trouble or fall into a fruitless exchange of fire. But perhaps the greatest danger, often unacknowledged, is that either an opener or a reply may leave one running with a ball gamelessly. So sometimes you have a ball and then you don't have a game, which is kind of an interesting thing to think. Of being, well, how do you get to that? How did you get into that position? Would that be worse than having a game without a ball? Probably, because you could maybe improvise something, but there's no players, no game. So that we began as talk peters out into an assertion of a view. We damage the talk of others most effectively by casting it back on itself, cutting off what other philosophers have sometimes called, or what philosophers have sometimes called, its intentionality, something both politeness and nastiness equally do. On the other hand, we do justice to the speech of others, preserving it as dialogue, perhaps even converting it into dialogue by taking issue with it, taking up the issue to which it refers, thereby conserving the referred within the referring. Such taking issue requires as much leadership as does opening the discussion. Now, I'm glad I actually started in what I had already read, because this passage is appearing to me a little bit differently now. As I approach trying to teach this assignment, that every time I come to it, I'm like, why did I do this? Because I really want something to happen. I want to communicate something, but I don't feel like I'm particularly good at it. So I need some help. in communicating this. And there are a number of barriers to communicating it, and I don't think I have power over all of them. But some of it I just need a little bit of help. Here's one. So in this assignment, it's you take a historical speech. It's even calling it that kills it for something like historical. God, boring. Take a speech from before your time, as I say, and continue it. So how do you continue something? Well, it's like the meaning of that is kind of has to be ambiguous, but it shouldn't be unclear, even if it's ambiguous. Here's one way to think about what it would mean to continue a speech. It would mean to kind of treat it dialogically. That is, to kind of have a position in relationship to it that allows for there to be play or something to develop. And if we just kind of say agree or disagree, and we don't, there we at least can give our reasons, actually. I can say, here's the reason I agree with this. And that can be a way of kind of playing and developing, being like, I see that move and I continue the move with another reason. But, or maybe the kind of gesture I'm thinking of is I like it or I dislike it. It's pleasant to me, where it has just some kind of, I treat it as just a kind of stimulus, being like, yeah, it's good. I like it more. And I don't have anything to say about it. I can't talk about it because I'm not really treating it with the complexity it has of saying, well, this moment of it, kind of pulling something out, saying, this way of saying it reminds me of something that I can take in this direction. Or this way of saying it helps me say something I want to say that's different, but related, because there's there's something that's shared here. So talking with the past is possible, but it does take a bit of practice to get a sense of how to do it with facility. But that's true of almost everything. As a conversation begins, so it continues, by each becoming the leader. In talking with our children or with our students, the task of leadership becomes accentuated. My job as a parent or a teacher requires me to talk in such a way that others can and will talk. Education consists in getting others to take the lead, a getting which itself requires leadership. Still, it is peculiar to suggest that everybody can be a leader. In typical organized human efforts, some lead while others follow. However, in talking with one another, perhaps even in the best of organizations, the issue itself takes precedence. Ultimately, the topic leads. And we're talking about the topic, it's that kind of, that shared place of, in classical theory of rhetoric, where we talk, where there are arguments to be made, where there's things to be had. That's really what kind of leads. He's saying in the best of organizations. That's what the leader is this kind of impersonal or interpersonal, but I don't love that term. It just seems kind of ugly to me, but it's a kind of interpersonal phenomenon is what takes leadership. It's not the leadership of decision. Many people imagine leadership as a kind of person who's able to decide and make decisions. But machines can make decisions too. So even that wouldn't mean that it has to be a personal power that decides. But thinking about leadership as decision-making is, I would say, a very, very modern bias towards understanding leadership. That was almost never... The classical model of leadership's often, or like in ancient Greece specifically, the Chinese model of leadership is extremely complicated with the concept of wei, and then the Taoist rejoinder of wu wei. Very interesting debate there. In the Greek, it's just a series of metaphors often of sheep herding, like herding, or steering a ship. It's like an activity is what leadership looks like. It could never be understood simply as a decision being made. That would have baffled them. They would have been like, what? Well, the decision, then you have to like do the thing. They're like, oh yeah. No, our model of leadership is alienated from that. I tell someone else to do it and they do it for me. So there's a reason why that concept has changed, because economic conditions have changed. Sounds simple, no doubt it is. It is also rare, whether in speech or in action, logos or praxis, speech or activity. More likely, I talk not with but to my children or my students, toward them rather than toward the issue. And listeners are not innocent either. It is easier for them to listen more to me, that is, to my formulation, my orders, my views, perhaps even to my moods and manners, than to what I am saying, to the issues inherent in that to which I refer, and which gives rise to my formulations and orders, perhaps also to my moods and manners. I don't think that that's bad, though. I think it would be bad to exclusively listen to that other thing. But you need to hear the signal and the noise. And sometimes you come to hear the noise as signal. Speakers and listeners alike can concentrate on the finger rather than on the moon. This is a famous Zen koan of, like, as I'm pointing at the moon, how do you know not to look at the end of my finger? And it kind of models lots of things. It's a Buddhist koan, but one way that people use this story is to model the nature of kind of inference, that the sign of the finger points to the moon, but you're the one who has to kind of say, oh, it's the direction of the finger and not just the tip of it. That is what it means. So the audience or the onlooker has to understand something. They have to do something. So here they're not doing that. They can just look at the finger and kind of miss the point, with the result that the play of discourse becomes vacuous and its tensions revert from ontological to social purport. And I don't love that distinction at all, but okay. We can't stop at every watering hole to comment, or, if he were here, that we would be talking about it, but he's not here. From an intending of the topic possibly emerging in focus to pretending of the status obtained by the interlocutors. You might now wonder how one can overcome talking to and instigate talking with. Yeah. Start talking with me, Cyril. Well, I imagine we all wonder about this. All of us who have noticed the difference and have not yet given up with our parents or children, students or teachers, colleagues and lovers, and so given up institutions themselves. I mean, it's interesting to think that institutions, like, why is that the leap here? Let's do the finger in the moon thing here with this thing. Why would be giving up on children and parents and students and teachers and colleagues and lovers be giving up on institutions? We tend to think about institutions as, I don't know how you think about institutions. You can let me know. But I think most people tend to think about institutions as kind of something official, something they're alienated from, the state, corporations, those kinds of things. Institutions can also mean, even in English, even in kind of dictionary level English, institutions are things that are established. They might be folkways, they might be kind of customs, they might be, really, any organized relationship might be thought of as an institution. The institution of the family, the institution of education, aren't just the educational institutions. Education goes on even outside of some official school. So what really is it then? Well, institution is a kind of way of organizing human life, and a lot of that is a way of talking. A lot of it is that. And you could say that kind of primitive or ancient institutions, and I don't mean primitive here in the sense of primitive people, I mean early or kind of simple institutions are really formulated through practices and talk without necessarily there being brick and mortar buildings. The institutions have to be there first in that kind of relationship between people. Talk itself engenders the wonder, if by nothing else than by the hollowness ringing out in instances of monologue, of vacuity. Something's vacuous, it's empty. Tellingly locatable both in the speech of the moment and in the topic itself. You can kind of feel something sometimes when you're like, oh, God, I'm trying to think of a good, without insulting someone who might stumble upon this, to be like, oh, I really hated our conversation. It was vacuous. An example of a kind of vacuous conversation I've been in a number of times, a kind of topic that tends to be vacuous. Trying to think of one. Maybe it's good that I can't immediately think of one anymore. I can tell you one. Some of it is like in the organizational life of institutions, there are things that have to be talked about, but that nobody cares about. Like, it is just kind of bureaucratic work, and that there's sometimes people will try to impress upon others that they actually do care about these bureaucratic decisions and things that have to be done. Like, they kind of create a persona that says that these things are important. In fact, that we all should care. And this is always such it like marks the vacuity of the moment. You're just like, it becomes kind of painful to be there. And you have to kind of exist in this world where we're pretending to care for some kind of social game that people are playing. That's one that comes to mind for me. Talking then has one advantage over reading and writing. It constantly recalls the difference. For when talking, the moment we cease both to speak and listen, neither accepting nor rejecting proposals, but allowing them to direct attention to the topic itself, the talk ceases to say anything, and we either part ways, fall into dumb silence, or gird ourselves for monotony. That was the one that describes what I was experiencing usually. Girding yourself for monotony, like, oh, I love this line from D.H. Lawrence, who said, whenever an artist, here's a good one, whenever an artist begins to tell me of my work, the flesh grows tired on my bones, where you just can kind of begin to feel that, oh, I'm just in this person's, this person's just going to read off their resume to me, and oh, you can kind of only gird yourself for the monotony of these kinds of experiences. The flesh goes tired on the bones. If we take to reading and writing, we do so perhaps in order to enter into modes of discourse, which display and encourage formulations better formed and sequences better directed than those possible in the meanderings of even the best talking. It's just, you can know someone who's a great conversationalist and listen to 1,000 podcasts, but there's a kind of level of specificity which goes into the way that time is organized in writing, that is impossible to achieve in talk. I think both have value, but they're different. The manifest failure of much talk, its fall from parole parlante into parole parlée, like speech that's speaking versus speech that's spoken. Like, okay, it's kind of a subtle difference, but maybe that's part of what he's trying to get the sense of the active and the passive difference and the attitude towards the kind of talk we're having. Sometimes drives one to the printed word, to literature. Yet reading and writing have their own pitfalls. Until talking with our fellows has initiated us into the playfulness of dialogue, namely the profound ignorance conditioning any joint enterprise of discourse, reading and writing can appear as alternating forms of monologue. You write, I read. I mean, right? That's how a lot of people view it, I think. Which is why when they find the thing that they like to read, they kind of almost feel guilty about it. They do it secretly. Like, oh, I really like to read this. It's like, well, maybe there's a reason you like to read that thing. It's worth investigating why you like to read that, because that will help you give you a better sense of how you might enjoy reading, rather than just seeing it as, oh, I enjoy reading because this thing did it to me. They're very passive in their reading. They can only enjoy something if it's just the right thing. It's like, well, you can be a little active in that, figure out what's going on that you like, and try to take that sense into other things that you read. No matter how dialogically written, a script cannot prevent a wily reader from pinning down static, apparently self-sufficient views, opinions within it. I mean, people do this, speaking of Plato, all the time with Plato's works. Very, the chair of the skull of the ancient sire of, these kinds of endowed chairs from thousands of years, who are very, very distinguished scholars, will still do this awful pablum stuff where they'll be like, Plato's view is X. They just kind of, I'm like, wow, you can read something that's so complex and be able to pull that out of it. Well, some people are trained to do nothing else. In the marrings of the book in a university library, one can read the desperation of previous readers, the insistence upon reducing the text to recognizable viewpoints, no matter what the cost. And he's talking about sometimes you go to a library and in the margin, sometimes in pencil, someone often kind of very earnest with maybe a particular hand that is quite recognizable. They have what I sometimes think of as the standard hand, often, not always. And they often have some standard ideas about how to interpret a text. And you can kind of feel, these are always a little bit of, I don't know how to feel about these because someone's kind of really trying hard, but they're trying hard to do the wrong thing of making it all, they're like, aha, yes, that is the thing that's familiar. That is the thing. And they just kind of keep looking for the thing they already know in the text. And they're not within their ignorance. Therefore, they understand nothing. And they're more ignorant than they were before they began reading. And the rough and tumble of the publishing world easily leads the writer to defend himself rather than what demanded response in the first place. Settling down alone at my desk to read or write, I forgo the steerage too readily available in live discourse. I have to enter into the dialogue, into both leading and being led. without the recurrent reminders of the simultaneity of the two, without any course corrections, except those which I am willing to hear from previous conversations. Perhaps, I think one thing, no course corrections, like, that's interesting to put it that strongly. I kind of agree, but for me, that's kind of a personal preference, where when I talk, even sometimes I'll put forward something that I don't agree with, like a position. I'll kind of like take a position just to because I think it'll be the most productive one, not necessarily because I agree with it. I think I think about it more as a way of moving things rather than as a place to stand. And that can be misinterpreted sometimes. And I'm actually okay with that. Which is, a privileged statement to be able to do. But it's also something to do with that privilege that I might have in some conversations to kind of do something else other than kind of have to always represent always speak from the position that I need to work to accurately represent my current sense of things. Because I know my sense is going to change. So I don't like when talk sometimes goes in the direction of constantly correcting, like, okay, well, no, I didn't mean that. I meant this. And we kind of keep going back to revising the same sentence. It's like, well, it's okay if you didn't mean it exactly, but let's see where it goes. Because we might both learn something about what it means if we kind of talk it out. Now, there's another way, though, that people can do it, and it can be like, oh, no, you said it, gotcha. And they never allow any revision of what is meant. And that's way worse. That's way worse, I would say. That's real violence against the kind of talk he's imagining here. Perhaps genuine reading and writing respond to earlier talk, to the fleeting emergence of a topic on occasions when we freely acknowledged our ignorance, and could therefore enter into the play of conversation, momentarily abandoning our pretension to knowledge. In this one sense, then, we might agree that the genuinely spoken precedes the genuinely written word. Department of Philosophy, Miles University, New Brunswick, Canada. This is the genuinely written word. Well, I like this essay. I like to talk with this essay. I don't agree with every way that he formulates things, but I would like to talk around this essay too, and I'd like to talk with you if you're here. But look at all these notes. Also, this is funny. You're not allowed to do this anymore. You're like really no journal. He has a footnote that goes on for, let's count it, 1, 2, 3, 4 pages. A footnote. Can't do that. An editor will not let you do that. They won't let you do it for like 2 sentences, much less 4 pages. So this is an older kind of thing in that respect, but it's not too old and not too far from a lot of the questions and concerns that we might have about trying to get to that sense of talking that doesn't feel like something you have to do, or that's kind of maybe instrumental to doing something else kind of talking. I think we can think about a few stages. I have more time here than I anticipated because I forgot that half of this is footnotes, which I could read, but I actually don't think I'm going to, because it's just like, it's getting really into the weeds. I can see in his piece on the heavens, De Kylo, Aristotle remarks. It's just, that's too in the weeds for my purposes. I'm interested, but, I'm not going to do that on Twitch. Unless you tell me to, then I will. But thinking about flirting, like flirting is probably not what he's imagining as good talk. But I've noticed that people are very bad at flirting now. And not just now, like also when I was flirting more. And because there's a sense of like, you have to both be open to the play that is involved in flirting, the play on meanings, the kind of ambiguity that is absolutely essential for flirtation to appear. And you have to enjoy it. That has to be something that's already enjoyable. Otherwise, it's technical, and that's not appealing to most people. Maybe there are some people to whom it's appealing. What can I say? What do I know? Maybe there's some people who like a real technical flirt. But that phrase just seems to me not to go well together. So these things that even where you might say, oh no, well the point is that's not like where you're going to have serious talk. Even in these other ways of relating to people that seem kind of trivial. Gossip doesn't seem to be one that's particularly prone to good talk, but there is definitely a difference between like idle gossip or mean gossip and good gossip. It's maybe a bit of a vice for some people, kind of an indulgence, and it's something that often I don't like. But I know that there are people who are good at gossiping, and there are people who gossip a lot and are not good at gossiping. Even in that way of talk, kind of being open to the play of how gossip works. There are, like Joan Rivers strikes me as someone who would be really fun to gossip with, but I don't think I would want to do it with David Letterman. It doesn't seem like it would be as fun. It would be kind of in one direction. The good gossiper often has to kind of be a good self-deprecator as well. Have to be good at recognizing that in the very thing that they're that is salacious, a kind of moment of participation of themselves, even in their interest in it, a kind of awareness of that might be part of what makes that talk good. And then what's the ignorance look like? Well, the ignorance means like, do we really know this? Otherwise, gossip falls into accusation and slander, and that's not fun. So flirtation, gossip, what are some other kinds of forms of discourse that people don't think of as good talk, or people like to enjoy, but are like, oh, that wouldn't be talk. Lying. No, okay, lying is not just like a form of talking, but there are some people who are really good at like kind of telling the tall tale, or lots of cultures have different forms of this. Sometimes they're even somewhat codified forms of the uncle figure, often for whatever reason in many cultures, who will kind of come in and tell lies. But they're artistic lies. They're lies that everyone already kind of knows they're lies. Maybe the young ones aren't totally initiated yet. They don't get that it's a lie. But they're good at bragging. They're good at lying, because there's a sense of an openness there of that kind of talk to the possibility of something being in it that could be interesting without being true. That could say something true without describing the truth of a situation. So all of these kinds of places, it doesn't have to be around philosophy. It doesn't have to be around the serious issues of the day. Even when we're gossiping, flirting, telling tall tales, there's an attitude towards it that I think might be more like this. But of course, it's also something that in the serious talk of life, we need to keep in mind. Why are people so scared of talking to relatives who are sick or dying sometimes? Why are we afraid to talk about our fears, our political fears, with other people who probably have similar fears? It's not to say that obviously just talking in any old way is the solution here. That's kind of missing the point. We need to talk. Doesn't mean, if you read this whole essay, that we need to kind of have some kind of conversation about it to mark it as a thing, like a ceremony. So we need it to make this open, to be uncertain together, to kind of put forward our knowledge, to develop a question of what to make of our world, of our life. What's good about it? What's important here for us? How do we think about our responsibility towards this matter? Others' responsibilities? How do we know what we want, what we desire, and what's the meaning of it? All sorts of things. So anyway, I thought I'd come in here tonight, have a little bit of a talk with you. That's pretty much it. I think we finished this one. I'm not going to read, as I said, I'm not going to read these long footnotes on the stream. Oh my gosh. Look at some of these things. Just a long, huge note about Aristotle's terminology that ends with a bit of Leibniz. yeah, old school, kind of. All right. Well, thanks for stopping by. If you have things that you want to talk about or things that you'd like to see on this strange channel, whatever we're going to call it. It is a channel, isn't it? A channel for something. Something's going through, I think. Then let me know. And you can join the Discord. And you can also find this on YouTube. So hopefully we find each other again sometime. And until then, keep talking. Let's keep talking.